Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the series where I'm recreating Murray's costume Manor from Secret of the Mimic in Minecraft. In the last episode we took a look at the workshop, the theater, and the south hallway, but today we're going to be moving on to the main warehouse, the loading bay, and the admin wing. Before getting started, I'd like to remind you that there is a project description in the video description, so make sure to give that a read in case you have any questions about the project. And the final thing is to make sure that you're subscribed to the channel with all notifications turned on, so that way you don't miss out on the rest of the series and can help the channel to reach 200,000 subscribers before the end of the year. But with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. Let's go ahead and take a look at what we're actually going to be building in this. Okay. We're doing this again, are we? I swear I'm not doing this intentionally. You would have thought I would have learned my lesson from last time, but I guess not. So let's just go ahead and do all of this in the debug camera. The main area that I'm going to be focusing on today is going to be the main warehouse. While this looks like a big open room with just lots of the same decorations all around the place, like these shelving units, these boxes, the same old that we've seen in other parts of the build, there is actually a few big things that I want to point out. First of all, this is easily the biggest room in all of MCM, as not only does it span over 2 floors, it also has these windows on the ceiling and also spans over almost the entirety of the MCM itself. It doesn't just start at this main warehouse here, it also goes even further back from one side of the MCM all the way to the other. But the size of the room is not the thing that I'm worried about, as I have built much bigger builds in the past. What I want to focus on is the color of the actual room itself, most importantly being these blue bricks here, because Minecraft doesn't have many blue blocks, especially not brick textured like this. So honestly, I think the most challenging part of this build isn't going to be the actual build itself, but it's going to be choosing a color scheme to work with, because you can see here, not only do we have 3 different shades of blue, but they also have different textures, ranging from a brick texture to these metal slates that have a striped pattern along the wall like this. I'm just gonna sneak by you. Now the loading bay is very similar to the warehouse in its scale, and also the fact it has lots of big props scattered around the floor. However, it's very different in its color scheme, as instead of having that blue texture to it, this room is mostly made out of bricks and other blocks that I've used so far in this build. It's especially helped that the fact that I could easily use blocks like bricks to do this, as not only does it have that brownish orange look to it, so I don't need to overcomplicate things, but I could also mix in a bit of granite to the build, so that way it has some of those withering details to go alongside it. And though it's not directly connected to the warehouse or the loading bay, I also want to finish up by building the entirety of the admin wing, as not only are the 3 areas connected right after each other during the gameplay, but this is also the final area that needs to be built before the entirety of the first floor has been completed. It's going to be a big jump going from larger scaled industrial rooms like the warehouse to these smaller scaled office spaces with lots of different colors. However, I think it's going to be really fun, as this also has one of my favorite environments in the entire MCM, despite it being my least favorite part of the entire game. I wonder why. But now heading over to Minecraft and the entirety of the MCM fully outlined, you can see how much of an impact these rooms are going to make to the overall build, as just these 3 sections alone take up half the build itself. And though I've already gone over how tricky it might be to recreate parts of the build, it's still going to be really nice to be able to recreate such big rooms like this, while they still have so much going on inside of them that makes each one so much different than the other. I can already see these rooms taking much longer to recreate than anything else so far, so let's just go ahead and get started working on the build. It's a nice break to be able to have these much larger rooms in this factory, as this game was advertised as having mostly tight and narrow walkways, and while that is true, there are some rooms like this which are very wide and open and have lots of space to wander around inside of them. Now with that being said, this is probably going to be the last one of those areas, as everything else from here on out is going to be back to those small, tight and narrow hallways, so being able to work on these for the last time is still really refreshing and really makes me appreciate what I'm building as I'm going about it. Even if it's the same decorations scattered around the place, with this being the main warehouse that's gonna have repeat of things from every other room, it's still nice to be able to put them around in different ways. You know, it's not the same thing over and over, while still having hints of previous rooms scattered around the place. This is especially true to the color scheming of things, as the more I think about it, I don't think there's a single room in MCM that looks the same as another. I've already talked about how challenging blue blocks can be to work with in Minecraft since there aren't a lot of them, but that just makes this part of the build stand out compared to everything else and makes each room have its own character, so that way you're not just going to forget that you were in a room for 5 minutes, you're actually going to think about it and remember it once you're actually out of there and finish the game. I'm able to use different types of blocks, and that's what really makes this build fun, as not only am I building in different ways, but using those different blocks in ways that work together really well has been a lot of fun to work around. Terracotta is not a block that I'm used to using, but I've found multiple ways to be able to use it. Then lining all of the room with grey blocks such as deep slate or basalt to have in all of those support beams, as well as tuff and mushroom blocks, which have ended up being some of my favourite blocks despite having a very niche use to them. They are very out there blocks that you wouldn't normally think about, but have helped this build come together really well, and again, I want to use these blocks more in my own builds. There's things I use one time and never really think about, but as long as a block looks like what I'm trying to recreate, I'm going to use it. It doesn't matter if it's dirt, it doesn't matter if it's gravel. When I build, I ignore what the purpose of the block is supposed to be, and I take a look at where I'm actually supposed to use it. This is somewhat related to what I say a lot on my live streams when I build modded pizzerias. There's lots of items that I use for specific purposes, whether it be a roof block or a floor block. I ignore all of that, and no matter how much chat whines at me for not being allowed to use a wall block for a ceiling or vice versa, if a block looks good in a certain context, why shouldn't you be able to use it? That is the most important part of the build after all, is making sure that not only the build looks good, but if you're recreating something, make sure that the build actually looks like what you're supposed to recreate. Now, of course, that can be difficult when Minecraft doesn't have the blocks that you need exactly, like those blue bricks. I had to mix around a different bunch of blue blocks together, but you also don't need to overly complicate things. If there's a brick wall, you don't need to take a look at the exact shading of it. If it's orange, you can just use the actual brick block. It's as simple as that. You don't need to overthink things. And that's something that's nice as well, where Minecraft lets you either think about what you're building where you can overcomplicate things, or if you want to, you can take the simple route and just use the actual block itself. I could have used bricks for the main warehouse where there are those blue bricks, but then I would have sacrificed the color scheme and then it wouldn't actually look like what I'm trying to recreate. So you can see how there's lots of different ways to go about building the same thing, and it's really up to personal preference and how you want to do it. At the end of the day, this is still my Minecraft project and I can do really whatever I want with it, but there are a few rules that I decide to follow along the way. Of course, sometimes it's okay to break those rules, but as long as there's some consistency with what you're building, it's still going to turn out great, and at the end of the day, it's going to be your build and you should be happy with how it turned out. It is a time-consuming process as it isn't going to get itself done by itself, but that is the fun in the challenge, which has honestly pushed me to do things that I wouldn't be able to, like again, using blocks that I wouldn't normally use, using building techniques that I wouldn't normally do. That is part of the challenge that I think has made me overall a better builder, despite the fact I'm not actually building my own thing and I'm just recreating something I see in another media. I am still very proud of the builds that I recreate, and even eventually if they become outdated, I'm able to look back at those previous builds that I might not look as fondly anymore and see what I've learned from there, and maybe there's things that I used to use that I don't anymore that I could go back to using. It's always important to be proud of your work and recognize that you've done it, and that will help you keep the motivation to keep on building. And as I expected, this easily took a long time to recreate, probably the longest out of any singular room. However, just looking at this place, this might easily be my favorite room so far. Obviously, there's so much going on, so it's just getting your eye to look at everything all at once, but also I'm really happy with how I actually went around doing all of these blue details. Obviously, like I mentioned earlier, there's no blue block in Minecraft that matched the texture 1-to-1, so what I ended up doing was mixing this light blue terracotta as the main block, but then adding in some darker blocks so that way it didn't look like it was all one solid color and made the room look much brighter than it needed to be. But enough talking about the walls, let's actually take a look at everything else that's going on here, as with this being the main warehouse of the build, everything is going to be stored here, from different shelves, to the mascot costumes, to the different attractions that would go in other areas, to everything you would expect to see in a costume manor. This room right here has it, which just adds so much more to the build instead of it just being rows and rows of shelving units. This trolley time tower right here, for example, is its own set attraction that you would find in a theme park, and while it doesn't work at the moment, it will eventually be able to bring the carriage up and down just like we see in game, so that way we're able to go from the first floor all the way up to the catwalk here, where we're then able to explore even more parts of the build. And not only does this build lead to other smaller areas within itself, but there's also all of the airlocks throughout the room, which also lead to multiple other areas around MCM, such as the security office behind this door, the south hallway behind this door, of course the loading bay all the way on the other side, and then eventually the admin wing behind this door right here. So this room almost acts as the central hub to MCM, almost like the atrium from Security Breach, where we have one large central room, where from there it can lead to almost every other room in the entire building. With that being said though, this room does have a few inconsistencies, which honestly I shouldn't be too surprised in the slightest, as we are talking about a steel wall game here. Now this is specific towards these windows here, as the windows do actually look to other areas of the build. For example, that window right there leads to the security office, and this window right here would lead to the manager's office. Now this is exactly how it's supposed to be in game, however these three windows right here are a bit weird. As you can see, there is a shelving unit covering it, however that's not intentional but also intentional at the same time. In reality, when you're standing in the warehouse, there's not supposed to be three windows along this wall here. However, there are three windows when you're in this side of the hallway going towards the manager's office itself. You're able to look through three windows to look down into the warehouse itself. The same also goes for these three windows right next to this carnival game, which are supposed to lead into the Jackie Showtime room. However, once again, on the other side of it, those windows don't show up. They do here though for some reason, so they are a little consistent with it, where there is a window that looks into the other side, however, they're more inconsistent than not. But moving on to the next area, I decided it would be best to go ahead and knock out the loading bay alongside it, as they're both right next to each other. I thought it'd be fitting to just go ahead and get both done right after each other. And like I was mentioning earlier on, it was a lot of fun to be able to put in all of these carnival attractions, where I've just noticed I didn't put those item frames right there. Let's just go ahead and do that quickly. Now this build is fully completed. But yeah, working with this smaller scale when trying to recreate larger objects like this giant Monty head here is still a lot of fun. It honestly reminded me of Security Breach, where they had these smaller scaled attractions that are supposed to recreate different things, which is again not something you would usually see in an industrial factory. But because this factory is recreating props that would be seen in carnival games, you're going to have some of these decorations that stand out and are a whole lot fun to put together. And though the attractions themselves don't actually move for the time being, or I can't move the crane to move around the different platforms, I am still able to sneak from one side of the build all the way to the other. That way I'm able to reach the opposite platform, where then I could once again theoretically use the crane to be able to move around the different platforms. Now with that being said, I'm only able to go from one side to the other, as I do actually need to rearrange all of these platforms, so that way I'm able to move from the second platform over to this side, where then I can eventually make it up to the second floor. And just like I thought, it wasn't challenging to decide what blocks I wanted to use for what. It was very expected. In fact, most of these blocks I have used in other parts of the build as well, like these bricks, the granite, which was exactly the combination I was talking about, and then a mix of polished deep slate or polished basalt to add in those support beams that go around the build itself. I'd go as far as to say that over half the MCM uses the exact same color palette for the floor, where it's just a mix of cyan terracotta, deep slate, and grey concrete powder, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be boring every room you go into, as the flooring has different decorations around it, whether it be a blue carpet to represent the top, or as you can see here, where I've once again used signs to recreate the caution tape that surrounds the entirety of the floor. I've been using these throughout the entire build in different ways, and they will always stand out as being such a fun and cool detail to add in every time. At the back side of the warehouse, you can see I once again used the exact same thing but in a different way, where instead of having caution tape, there's red lining that goes across the entire flooring instead. Now the only thing about this is that when I'm going about using this method, I do have to use grey carpet on top of it, as otherwise we're going to be able to see the sign. It's that one single pixel that really adds in this detail, but because I'm only able to use carpet, it does limit what I'm actually able to use when it comes to making the floor. So you could argue that it'd be a better technique to just go ahead and use a full red block instead of this. However, I still like having my builds have something that stands out even more, especially when working in smaller scales, because the moment you start adding in full blocks, that's when it's going to start adding in lots more space and could end up clashing with other parts of the build. And then for the final area, I wasn't actually planning on building this right now, and I was going to leave it for when I do the rest of the second story. However, because it connects to all of those same areas that we've just gone through, I thought it was worth adding in this top warehouse which goes across the entirety of the second floor. We started over at that side, which is going to lead to both the warehouse and the loading bay, but as we make our way all the way to the other side, it's then going to lead to the showroom hallway, as well as the welcome show all the way at the start of the build. But this now finally leads us to the admin wing, which, like I mentioned earlier, is the final room that needs to be added before the entirety of the first floor of MCM has been fully built. And though it looks a lot smaller in scale since it's only a few blocks tall, I can see this still taking quite a long time to recreate, as it's very spread out but also has so many details stacked on top of each other that make the rooms feel very cramped and compact, despite the fact that they aren't as wide as some of those larger rooms. And though a lot of work has already been done so far this episode, there's still a lot more that needs to be done before I'm able to wrap things up. So let's not waste any more time and get right back into building. It really didn't surprise me to see that the admin wings took longer to recreate than the loading bay did, as though the loading bay was very simple with its color scheming, its block choice, and all of its decorations, the admin wing has so much more variety going on, which sounds surprising because it's just the same desks all around the place, the same carpet patterns and things like that. But what you don't really expect is the time it takes to A, find those blocks, and then B, change your inventory to something completely different when there's another part of the build that is completely a stark contrast to what you just saw. For example, this room right here, the meeting room, has a completely different color scheme from the main part of the office space, where instead of having those bright yellow colors, you then have a different carpet design, which uses a mix of different blocks, which floods up the inventory, and just makes it difficult to navigate all over the place. There's a lot of things like that that you don't really consider when building, especially when I show this off in these videos, that take up time that you wouldn't expect. Another example is actually planning out where I'm actually going to be doing things before I even get started on the build. I spend a lot of time planning. I always want to make sure I know what I'm doing before I get into things, and this is no different, where before I actually get started, I make sure I know what blocks I'm going to use. Even if it's not an exact specific one, I know the general idea, whether I've made a small test just to see what it looks like. But then I also need to go around the place and see where I'm going to start, where it's then going to lead me to, and how I'm going to transition all the way to the end, so that way I can finish up the build. This is also really helpful when it comes to actually making time lapses of this stuff, as if I were to just go from one side of the build to another, it would make things really difficult to control, and the camera would have to go from one side of the building to another, or get an overall look to things. So not only do I really have to be specific specific with what I'm building at a time, but I also need to consider that I am going to be making a replay of this later where I have to manually move the camera around so that way it can see what I'm building without having to go from one place to another all so often. So there is a lot of planning that goes into this build outside of just the build itself that I don't think I've ever really talked about. I do use the replay mod for these time lapses, which I would highly recommend for yourself, as not only is it a fun mod just to mess around with, but it also lets you look back on these builds and see you take 6 hours worth of work and turn it into 3.5 minutes, which might seem really bad, like it looks like all that work has just been amounted to not much, but you're able to see the progression throughout it and see things come together, which just looks really satisfying looking back on it. But going back to the planning side of things, because this build is so big and I want to focus on one room at a time instead of multiple, I don't want to go back later on and change entire builds, so it also takes time making sure that I am happy with what I'm doing. That way I don't have to redo an entire section just because I don't like the way I outlined it or a block choice. Admittedly, it would be a lot easier to replace a single type of block instead of doing an entire outline again, especially with a build like this, but that's just another example of how I always like to be prepared when going into projects. I'm sure I'm not the only one, but I'm curious to see what you think down in the comments. With the admin wing now fully completed, you can now see what the build looks like all together, where all that's left right now are all the showrooms on the second floor, before I'm then able to move on to the basements, as well as the mansion and the exterior. This is another one of those types of areas that I find really cozy and fun to explore, as though it's not as wide open and grand as some of the other builds, it's still got a very nice polished professional look to it. This is of course the office space where you'd have all of the business side of things happening in all of these office cubicles, but that's also something I like. I like those big open grand areas, but I also like when things are done professionally and have a professional look to them. Now that really shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone, as I am literally wearing a business suit. But it's not just desks and other chairs scattered around the place, there are actual other rooms that you'd find in office spaces as well, like the small break room here, which of course has been turned into a party room to celebrate David's birthday. This ended up probably being the most colorful room in the entire build, as not only was the carpet itself very interesting to put together with multiple different types of blocks, but then of course you have all of the birthday decorations which normally have a brighter tone to them. And I think what also helps the build itself overall look much brighter are all of the cupcakes scattered around the place, as though these are much bigger than they're supposed to be as seen in game, I didn't want to leave them out, so I decided for the time being I'm going to build them out of a mix of blocks, so that way it still adds in all of the details that the admin wing is supposed to have. Now moving on to the second floor, it once again is very tight and compact and has lots of professional items scattered around. However, like I mentioned, because of the amount of decorations that go in every room, it makes a lot of them seem very overcrowded, and this goes back to what I talked about earlier with block vomit, where it can look like I'm just placing down blocks at random. However, I honestly feel like this adds to the build, as it makes it feel more spacious in a way, which sounds weird because the rooms themselves are quite literally filled up, but it helps make them feel more lived in, as if every room has a purpose, despite the fact that there isn't an actual gameplay mechanic going on in every single one of them. Of course, this then all leads up eventually to Edwin's office, where once again we have a more down-to-earth color scheme with lots of wood around it, as not only is this place worn down with the amount of cobwebs around the place, but it just has a very traditional and classical look. You know, this is a very well upkept place with lots of high-end furniture, including even a fireplace to this room. There's a lot of fun details that can be fun to explore and figure out as I'm building. A similar thing can be said about all of the computer monitors, where again, I've built them out of blocks for the time being, as otherwise it would make the room feel empty and completely pointless. So by using a mix of slabs, item frames, and signs, I've been able to make it look like there are plenty of monitors along the walls, while also not having every one of them be a block big, so that way we don't actually see the wall behind them. Now, something I want to bring up about the surveillance room is the vent right next to it, as this is one of the scenarios where MCM starts to ignore logic and instead focuses on more of the gameplay. For example, this vent here leads us to the elevator room that leads down to the tunnels. However, the vent itself only lasts about this long before we then drop down and instantly teleported to the other room. However, in reality, that room is nowhere near the surveillance room, so what I've done is taken the liberty of extending the vent in a more accurate way. That way it actually connects from the surveillance room all the way down to the room that it's supposed to lead to. This is similar to the window situation in the warehouse, where it doesn't actually change the build itself. I'm still able to get from point A to point B. It's just like that in game, so that way we don't spend 10 minutes crawling through a vent system before ending up where we need to be. In this map, however, of course I want everything to be connected, so we do have that long winding vent system that does eventually lead to this server room. I must sound like a broken scratch record at this point, as I always keep bringing this up, but being able to recreate other games in a Minecraft form is something that I can never get over, because it always looks different every time, and there was something specifically about these areas that have honestly made it the most fun part of this project so far. The entire project has been a lot of fun, being able to mess around with different building techniques, but there was something about these rooms that I really attached to and made it almost the most memorable part so far, even though I'm about halfway done with this project, if even that close. That and the fact that there were a few times where I had to think about what blocks I was actually going to use for some builds, instead of just looking at my inventory, picking the first block that comes to my mind, and then using that throughout the entire build. I actually had to use a different combination of blocks in a way that not only does Minecraft not really help me out with it, but also in a way that makes it look similar to what I'm actually recreating. Either way, this has been an extremely productive week for working on this project, and I'm really curious to see what you think about it and are excited to see what I'm going to be doing next. So make sure that you're subscribed to the channel with all notifications turned on, so that way you don't miss out on the next episode and can stay up to date with the rest of the series. But with that being said, thank you everyone so much for watching, and I will of course see you in my next video.